Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me in the back of the room? All right. Thanks for your patience. It's wonderful to see all of you in the room. My name is Manu Karga. I'm a co-editor of 1804 Books. I'm really honored and happy to be with you here at the panel. You can hear me? Sure. My name is Manu Karga. I'm a co-editor of 1804 Books. I'm really happy to be with all of you here today at the panel, A People's Economy, Resisting Debt, Sanctions, and Resource Theft. So we are here in Los Angeles, in occupied Mexico, at the People's Summit, which really is the true summit of the Americas, right? The other summit, who's there? The exploiters and the mercenaries. It's outrageous that they claim to speak for the people of this hemisphere. At the end of NATO operations on Libya, then Vice President Joseph Biden said that moving forward, this is the way the United States will fight wars. On the surface level, he was speaking about what appeared to be no US casualties in those military operations. So this is how the US will fight wars. But if we think about the effects of those operations, the execution of Gaddafi, the destruction of the Libyan state, I think then Vice President Biden was telling us something when he said, moving forward, this is how the United States will fight wars. A few months ago, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the new concept of what he calls integrated deterrence. This is in his words, whole of government approach to achieve US strategic objectives. By whole of government, part of what he means is that this is an approach that involves not just the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA. It also involves the Treasury Department. It involves the Commerce Department. It involves the Federal Reserve. It involves the Department of Labor, the Department of Education. Integrated deterrence is another way of describing what many have called hybrid war. Economic war is one of the dimensions of hybrid war, of what Secretary Austin calls integrated deterrence. In the economic war that's practiced by the United States, we see things like the theft of sovereign assets, the theft of international reserves, international aid conditioned on desired election outcomes, illegal and unilateral sanctions. All of these techniques, if you want to call it that, all of these have been employed for decades against the countries of the Americas. And they speak of human rights in their summit of the exploiters and mercenaries. So we're gathered here today to learn and think together about a people's economy, about resisting debt, sanctions, and resource debt. And before I go any further, we have interpretation devices available. If any of you would find that useful, if you'd like to get them, you can get them outside in a tent behind the art exhibit. All right, so let's move forward to our speakers. Our first speaker today is Abby Martin. Abby Martin is an investigative journalist, an independent investigative journalist and activist, the founder of the citizen journalism project Media Roots, and the creator of the documentary and interview series, The Empire Files. She also hosts the podcast Dosed and Media Roots Radio. She's the director of Gaza Fights for Freedom and is currently working on an anti-imperialist environmental documentary titled Earth's Greatest Enemy. Abby Martin.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a great honor to be included in the conversation. Right now at Biden's Summit of the Americas, the United States is posing as the arbiter of human rights and democracy. It's granting itself basically the right to dictate the future of Latin America. And we know that several countries are excluded from the summit for the crime of charting their own paths, their own future. not being subservient to the empire. And all that this summit really is for Biden to project imperial dominance over a region that he calls his front yard. A recent costs of war study reveals that US counterterrorism operations have been active in 83 countries in the last 3 years. In Latin America alone, there have been about 60 US military interventions since 1890. The United States perpetuates this daily violence and subjugation, not to spread democracy or human rights, but to extract resources and protect capital. This global empire does not only use brute military force to impose capitalism's world order. It's learned from past blunders of obvious coups and regime change wars that have come to define its naked imperialism. During the Cold War, they were pretty open about this, right? They were open about the threat of communism posed to this order. Today, the premise of the empire remains the same, but it speaks in a much different language, a language of humanitarian intervention and basically doublespeak, right, of humanitarianism, liberal interventionism, and so on. It cloaks its goals and control through hybrid war, methods of mass propaganda, and economic warfare through the use of sanctions, which they call soft power. Sanctions are administered with the pretense of peaceful coercion to bypass war, but the reality is that sanctions are war, and they cause the same amount of mass suffering and death, just with plausible deniability. Of course, sanctions are nothing new. We all know the horrific devastation wrought by sanctions during the Gulf War in the 90s. That killed 500,000 children. But in a post-9/11 world, the US system of financial weaponry has grown with extreme precision. The Patriot Act gave the Treasury power to sever ties between US economic infrastructure, which most of the world relies on, and entire national jurisdictions. This causes a profound chilling effect for all global institutions who opt to cut off entire countries rather than risk penalties. These sweeping powers are unconstrained and largely undefined, and have the power to decimate economies and leave countries in financial ruin. From 2000 to 2021, the use of sanctions increased nearly 1,000%. Leaders from both parties use them now as the primary method to force countries to fall in line. Trump dramatically increased sanctions on every targeted country, and Biden has pretty much maintained all of them. According to Biden's Treasury Department, they are the foreign policy tool of first resort. And today, US sanctions affect a third of humanity, with more than 8,000 measures on 42 different countries. Presidents no longer have to deal with pressuring Congress into voting for war, no, not because they would face any real opposition for doing so, but because they can cause debilitating harm against their so-called adversaries with barely any oversight or media coverage. When Venezuela's economic freefall, Cuba's food shortages, or Afghanistan's severe famine are even covered by the corporate media, the utterance of sanctions is almost always omitted in the context of why these things are happening. It's always just in a vacuum, right? It's always on the shoulders of those governments. At Biden's summit down the street, they're gonna tell you that these sanctions are good and they're necessary in the interests of human rights and democracy. They're gonna say that they're justified because they only target despotic leaders whose values don't represent ours. That's the first big lie, obviously. Anyone can look at who the US supports around the world and see that its closest allies are theocratic dictatorships like like Saudi Arabia, of course, military dictatorships like Israel, or flagrant human rights abusers like Colombia or Uganda. Not only do these countries not get sanctioned, but they all receive massive financial assistance, military aid, training. All of these countries serve as linchpins for the empire in their respective continents. And nothing they can do, including the mass killing of peaceful protesters or the state-sanctioned execution of American journalists, will warrant the United States to break these bonds. The second big lie is that the United States has the ordained right to decide which countries should be subjected to punishment, what leaders a country deserves, and the process in which they can choose these leaders. If people elect a leader that they do not like for something as simple as wanting to take out IMF loans, not wanting to take out IMF loans, or for wanting to use their own resources for their own people, the United States will use its massive amount of leverage as a superpower to dole out extreme punishment. You must accept your role as a colonial imperial outpost, or you will face consequences. This is gangsterism. The third and most insidious lie is that Biden's summit is telling right now is that sanctions only impact the powerful, the elite, and their corrupt inner circles. With the help of corporate media, this lie has been facilitated very well, and in fact, a lot of well-intentioned liberals also believe this to be true. They think, well, we have to do something, right? We have to punish these elites in power who abuse their people. But literally anywhere you look where sanctions are deployed, the opposite is true. Sanctions are specifically designed to target the most defenseless and vulnerable people, the young, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. They cause massive food shortages. They force people to ration basic goods they need to survive. They directly target the public infrastructure of those countries, and they sadistically deny healthcare and life-saving medication for people who need it. In Venezuela, we know that in just 2 years, sanctions were responsible for the deaths of 40,000 people. And I know that we've heard the statistic, but before moving on, I just really want you to sit there and wrap your mind around it, because it's really horrific, right? 40,000 lives extinguished, 40,000 people whose families are shattered, 40,000 people. It's a statistic that we just say, right? But we can't even comprehend how many people that is. And that's just a drop in the bucket for the empire. Again, plausible deniability. In Cuba, the blockade has continued to tighten more and more to the point that life-saving vaccines could not be administered because they could not import things like syringes. During the height of the pandemic, government officials had to make the choice, the heart-wrenching choice, to give COVID patients oxygen or babies formula. Imagine making that choice. Do you give someone oxygen to survive, or do you give a helpless infant what they need to have a chance at life? That's the choices that Cuban officials are making daily because of the barbarism from this government and the economic blockade that continues. This is nothing short of economic terrorism that deprives tens of millions of people the human right to live freely. It is collective punishment, and it is a crime against humanity. The purpose of sanctions is not to pressure leaders to adopt human rights. It's to make these populations in these countries feel so much pain and suffering that they feel that the only way they can improve their lives is if they overthrow their government and somehow install a pro-US government that will alleviate their suffering, right, and leave them be. That's their objective strategy. That is literally what they think sanctions will do. But what really happens, right? What really happens when the US succeeds in getting what they want, as they have dozens of times in Latin America alone? They send in henchmen at the IMF and the World Bank to force reliance on the US dollar, to make these countries take out massive loans with strict conditions to prevent them from developing on their own. For example, we know one of the reasons for the US-backed coup in Haiti is because they were thinking of raising the minimum wage. And of course, multinational corporations could not have that, right? They wanted Haiti to basically maintain as a sweatshop for multinational corporations. So they decided to back a brutal coup for the crime of wanting to give their people a better life. The countries that bow to the dictates of the United States remain in a state of utter destitution. US control does not mean an improvement in your daily lives or the quality of life. It just means military bases will be in your country that destroy your land. It means that the natural resources are stripped and stolen. It means that your sovereignty has been robbed. As Michael Parenti once said, there are no poor countries. You don't go to poor countries to make money. These countries are rich. Only the people are poor. These countries are not underdeveloped. They are overexploited by the capitalists who steal trillions of their wealth. These billionaires are sick sociopaths. We all heard Elon Musk proudly boast, "We will coup whoever we want." They are shameless. And the whole purpose of Biden's summit down the street is to say that all these problems that face Latin America could be solved by the United States, our leadership and guidance of this great country. But what everyone in this room knows already, and what I've seen firsthand in Cuba and Venezuela and so many other places, is that it's not the politicians from the imperial core that have the answers. It's the poor and working people who have the answers. They know how to use their resources for their own people and for their own good. Even under the most horrific and repressive conditions that this government imposes on so many tens of millions of people around the world, the people will always find a way to survive. And the harsher conditions become, the more class consciousness grows, one rooted in international solidarity, one that links the struggles we all face to capitalism, militarism, imperialism. That's the real threat. Taking the power back and telling the Pentagon that no, you will not be the ones that dictate our future. We will decide our own future, and we will fight for our lives to do so. Thank you.
Abby talked about the right to dictate the future, and it makes sense that sanctions would be the primary weapon for international finance capital, the primary weapon for the imperialism of our times. Our next speaker is Hannah Appel. Hannah Appel is a co-founder of the Debt Collective, the United States' first debtors union. The Debt Collective has abolished over $5 billion in student debt, medical debt, payday loans, probation debt, and credit card debt. Their student debt campaign put full student debt cancellation and free public college on the political map. Appel teaches anthropology at UC Los Angeles, where she serves as the associate director of the Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. She's an economic anthropologist interested in transnational capitalism and finance, debt and debtors unions, Africa's place in global capitalism, and anti-capitalist abolitionist social movements.
Cool. Thanks so much, Manu, for that introduction. And true to my professorial self, I brought a PowerPoint, y'all. Just saying, there's PowerPoint. So I'm thrilled to go after Abby, in part because I want to address what Abby called financial weaponry. And in particular, I want to talk about how to fight this financial weaponry, methods for taking the power back from financial weaponry. And the method that I'm going to share today or introduce today is the method of a debtors union. There are some debt collective organizers in the house. It's lovely to see you. Shout out Renee Moya. Some familiar UCLA faces too. So it's great to see everybody. Okay, so just a few weeks ago, on April 4th, 2022, the Debt Collective, which is the nation's first, this nation, the US first debtors union, staged a large, jubilant, militant, Black woman-centered student debt protest at the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. And the image that you see in front of you is an image from that. And just to give you some vibes, I'm gonna play you, oops, I'm gonna figure out how to use the PowerPoint. I'm just gonna play you a hot second from D.C. just to get us all in the mood. Am I gonna do it? I am gonna try to do it. Okay, woo, right? Yeah. So shout out to Dr. Shamel Bell, one of LA's own and working right now as the radical visionary instigator, I think is her official title with the Debt Collective, but also one of the founders of BLM LA. So shout out, Shamel, and thank you for all your work. So the very next day, right, that was April 4th, the very next day, Joe Biden announced yet another extension of pandemic-related student debt payment moratorium. This was an additional extension that he and his administration vowed would never happen, right? The day after that protest, which was big, it was loud, it was well covered in the media, they'd offer another extension. So with aggregate student debt at $1.8 trillion, 1.8 billion, I have a typo in here, second only to mortgage debt in terms of aggregate household debt in the US, and held disproportionately by Black women, a decade of debtor organizing, which I'm going to tell you about in a second, was having immediate effects on national policy, right? The very next day, he extends the moratorium, edging the federal government ever closer to student debt abolition. But the extension of the payment pause wasn't the only immediate effect, and I don't know if you can see that, but the very same day, right, April 5th, the stock value of SoFi Technologies Incorporated plummeted. So, I know, right? This is what I'm talking about, the financial weaponry. So SoFi, for those of you who don't know, which I hope is nearly all of you except for that stupid stadium named after it, is an online finance platform that offers everything from investment to banking to insurance, but their bread and butter has been refinancing high-interest loans, and student loans in particular, which the federal government finances at about 7% compounding interest, which I bet a lot of us know, including me, because we all have it. So, with the federal government, who in the case of student debt is lender, collector, and regulator of student debt, backed into a corner by this powerful debtors union, and our numbers are actually at about $15 billion in debt abolition, and I'll talk to you about that, for people who attended for-profit colleges in particular. I am being told to slow my roll. Thank you very much. SoFi seems to see the writing on the wall. Why refinance with a private company when you can organize collectively as debtors and use that leverage to cancel debts? So just to give you a sense, I said we're at about 15 billion. That's just in the cancellation of debts for folks who attended for-profit colleges, and you may or may not recognize that signature. It's Betsy DeVos. It was actually Donald Trump's Secretary of Education who was signing, yeah, I agree, but look what we made Betsy do. Look at the red arrow on the bottom. She is signing discharge notes with extreme displeasure. Yes, right? But the point is, fuck whoever is in the White House. When you build power, we have won debt cancellation under Obama. We have won debt cancellation under Donald Trump. The first billions were under Donald Trump, and we are winning it. We just got a big $6 billion win that I'll tell you about in a second under Joe Biden, right? When you build power, it doesn't matter who's up there because you have the power to force them, albeit with extreme displeasure, to do shit that they don't want to do. Okay, so we formed the Debt Collective in 2014, emerging out of Occupy Wall Street, and it's premised on an emancipatory reading of household debt under finance capitalism. Here it is. What if mass indebtedness is not simply an individual liability? What if it's a potential collective asset or leverage point in the fight to enact the new and radical economic worlds that we need? And I'm going to explain that in a second. So scholars, activists alike often think of financialization, right, as a form of democratic foreclosure, exacerbating class inequality, exacerbating race inequality, exacerbating intersectional inequality, disempowering communities. But at the Debt Collective, we organize around the provocation that actually the age of finance makes a new strategy for collective action possible. In other words, the very circumstances that have plunged us all into debt, not only in the United States, but far beyond, contain the conditions of their own subversion. Okay, so what kind of counterpower is possible under finance capitalism, right? What kind of counterpower do we need to speak back to these financial mercenaries? Debtors' unions. That is our provocation. Okay, so how does this work? I'm going to put it in words often attributed to a very famous capitalist, John Paul Getty, who famously said, if you owe the bank $100, the bank owns you, right? Which is to say you have to pay that back. But if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. You have power over that bank to set the terms of your relationship with them. With student debt alone at $1.8 trillion, ignore me earlier, it is trillion with the T. Sometimes I can't even believe my own damn self. $1.8 trillion with the T, and surging levels of everything from medical debt to carceral debt to rent debt across the United States and far beyond. Debtors own the banks. Debt, leveraged jointly in a debtors union, can force the financial system to recognize people, not banks, as systemically important and too big to fail. Okay, so today, this is not just like a theoretical provocation, right? This is a proven strategy, a proven tactic. We start in 2015 with the Corinthian 15. You may have seen them in the news recently, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The first 15 people to publicly declare themselves on a student debt strike. Around 2016, 2017, we put a form of legal mutual aid online called Defense to Repayment. 80,000 people used it, and very quickly, union members were invited to DC for a negotiated rulemaking, making Defense to Repayment the law of the land. Were we asking elected officials for anything? No. We were using the collective power of debt to say, do this. We have the power, okay? So then, actually, just like last week, literally, $5.8 billion in loans will be forgiven, we didn't sin, right? Will be canceled, will be abolished for Corinthian college students. Biden okays $5.8 billion in debt relief for Corinthian students, and pressure grows to abolish all student debt. You can see here, estudiantes, beneficiados, right? Univision covered it, Telemundo covered it, and thanks to Renee, who did the rad Spanish language press. Okay, so narrowly, the potential of debtors' unions is, of course, to renegotiate debt contracts, right? Just like narrowly, the potential of a labor union is to renegotiate contracts, to give debtors bargaining power over interest rates, repayment terms, racist lending practices, and securitization processes. But, and this is the part I want you to listen to, more broadly, debtors' unions aim to build collective power, with collective debt refusal as leverage in the age of finance capitalism. Because who better than medical debtors to exercise the leverage necessary to win Medicare for all? Student debtors to win college for all. Housing debtors to win social housing. Carceral debtors, and if you don't know what that is, we can talk about that in Q&A, to drain the prison industrial complex of its resources in a move toward abolition. Right? So at the Debt Collective, we're best known for our work in student debt, but we're also doing some exciting work in carceral debt. Renee Moya, sitting right here amongst you, is leading the work on housing debt, the tenant power toolkit you see here. So to finish my 10 minutes, because I'm here at the People's Summit with comrades and fellow organizers, I actually want to end by posing 3 questions. These are genuine questions. This is not a weird professorial, oh, I have a question that I actually know the answer to. These are genuine questions that I would love to talk about with panelists and audience members. Okay. So, at the Debt Collective, we run up against a classic problem in organizing. We know that indebtedness under racial capitalism is systemic, right? What that means is that the precipitous rise of medical debt, student debt, carceral debt, municipal debts in our public education systems or our court systems, our city and regional budgets, they're not incidental to one another, right? They're symptomatic of a broad underlying problem. Private debt financing goods and services that should be publicly financed, whether through taxation, whether through federal spending, and some that shouldn't be financed at all, right? Like the prison industrial complex. But when organizing and leveraging the power of debtors in a union formation, our strategies become siloed by the variegated landscape of creditors. In student debt, it's the federal government. But in carceral debt, it's bail companies, local courts, prison profiteers, some large insurance companies. In medical debt, it's hospitals, it's insurers. In housing debt, it's large corporate landlords. And any one of those unionization efforts is extraordinarily difficult, requiring years of organizing. So what kind of analysis and tactics do we need to get at those underlying and common systemically important financial actors? Because across so many of those domains I just mentioned, from monthly rent payments to municipal budgets, it is the world's biggest banks who are at the end of the thread. So what are the strategies that could unsilo our work and get debtors leverage over those big institutions faster. We shouldn't have to organize with housing debtors here and medical debtors here because all of those payments eventually trickle up to the same institutions. So what does it mean to organize the strike by institution rather than by sector, if I'm going to use a labor union analogy? So I'm going to skip, there's question 1. I'm going to skip question 2 that I'm happy to talk about it. It's a question about financial markets, but I want to be mindful of time. This is the last question, and it's specific for this extraordinary event that I'm honored to participate in. And it's the transnational question. Mass indebtedness connects those of us living in the United States with millions of others around the world. It connects Ferguson, Missouri, where municipal debt has been central to racialized police violence and the rise of Black Lives Matter, to Athens, Greece, where sovereign debt and an ultimately unsuccessful left takeover illustrated the necessity of transnational debtor organizing in the face of the Troika. It connects Puerto Rico, obviously part of US empire, to El Salvador, dollarization, which I think we'll hear about in a moment. And these aren't like theoretical links, right? These are financial connections through shared institutions like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, BlackRock, of course, the World Bank, and the US Federal Reserve, gesturing to Abby, the lender of last resort to the world. Because racial capitalism is and always has been transnational, so too must our world building against it, with, of course, significant responsibility on those of us who unevenly wield the power, the inordinate power of the US dollar. So the question is, how can we build transnational debtors unions with those shared targets of transnational finance? Because those targets are also transnational. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for your time.
How do we fight financial weaponry? It brings to mind the patient analysis and teachings and proposals of Fidel Castro decades ago about the possibility of building solidarity among third world nations to fight and oppose third world debt. It raises, the analysis is there, the proposals are there, the vision is there about sovereignty, as solidarity as a tool to achieve a genuine people's sovereignty. Our third speaker is Manuel Bertoldi, a leader of the Frente, Patria, Grande of Argentina and the coordination of the International People's Assembly.
Bueno, disculpen, pero voy a hablar en español. Voy a tratar de hacerlo lento. Gracias por la invitación. La verdad que es un enorme placer poder estar aquí.
An enormous joy to be here in this summit of the people. And it's really an honor to share this panel with the Compass to discuss this. When Abby spoke, I was also remembering the role that the United States played, the government, in the coup in Bolivia in 2019, during the process of the most interesting in our region. Also, it was really good to see the visibilization of the situation in Haiti, a country where till now it's been subjected for having been irreverently had the first Black War in our continent, without which we wouldn't have been able to think about the big nation. And today, till this date, the empire has not forgotten about this. The story has been very clear, and they make us pay this every day. We are going through a crisis, a systemic crisis, and the imperialism is losing more and more the control that it had over the territories worldwide, which makes it even more dangerous. The economic capital that has been concentrated reinforces the exploitation on workers and nature to maintain even its profits. We live in this world, an inequality that has never been seen before. To that end, they reinforced individualism, xenophobia, racism, to destroy the social textile and divide our communities and to strengthen their strategy In this framework of a systemic crisis,
Estados-nación
the
evidencian
state
cada vez
nations
más su crisis,
show more and more their level of crisis, the
mostrando la
status of crisis,
imposibilidad de
showing the
atender las grandes
impossibility of
necesidades de las mayorías populares.
to
Las
to deal with
democracias
the
liberales
necessities of
burguesas
people,
como
the
mecanismos de
democracies, the bourgeoisie
participación
democracies
son
with
cada vez menos
participating
eficaces
democracies
para nuestros
are less
pueblos
and
y no
less
las asumen
effective
nuestros
for our
pueblos
communities,
como herramientas para lograr
and they are
cambios
not tools
que
for
mejoren
our
su vida.
communities to improve their
Las y
lives.
los jóvenes,
The
sobre
young
todo,
people,
se
especially,
desencantan de un
are
modelo que
disillusioned
no les
with a model
garantiza
that
poder
does not
resolver su
guarantee them
perspectiva de futuro,
to be able to
gana un
resolve their
sentimiento de
futures.
antipolítica,
They
incluso
see
en
an
los sectores
anti-political
populares, anclado en
sentiment
esos
grow,
valores
especially in the
que
popular
mencionaba
environment
anteriormente.
that I was mentioning before.
Desde el punto de vista
From the
económico,
economic point of view,
las deudas externas
the
han
external debt
funcionado
have worked
como instrumentos de saqueo
as
y sometimiento
exploitive and
de los países del
subjective
sur global.
strategies
En
for the countries in the
1985
global
ya
south. In
nuestro
1985,
líder,
our
comandante
leader, our
Fidel
commandant Fidel
Castro,
Castro,
en su discurso
in
en
his
el encuentro que
in
se
his
hizo
speech
para
in
tratar
the
la problemática de la deuda
in
externa,
the event to try to
planteaba que
deal
el
with the external
cobro
debt
de esta
was
deuda
saying that
y el
the
sistema
repayment
injusto de
of this
relaciones
debt and the
económicas
unjust
es la más
system of
flagrante y más brutal
internal
violación de los
relationship is
derechos
the most
humanos que pueda
brutal
concebirse.
type of repression
Una
that we can think
parte
of in terms
pequeña del
of
conjunto de la
human
deuda se
rights.
invirtió en
Part
cosas
of this,
útiles, pero
some of
todos
the
sabemos
debt
que una
was
gran
used to
parte
pay for
se
some
invirtió en armas, se
beneficial things, but a
despilfarró,
big
se
part of that was used for
malversó, se
weapons. It was
malgastó, y sabemos
used,
además que una gran parte se
and
fugó
we know that a
sin
lot
siquiera
of
llegar
a
a América
percentage of
Latina.
that
Esto lo decía
basically
Fidel
was disappear without really
hace 30
reaching
años.
Latin America. Fidel used to say this
Nosotros en
over 30 years
Argentina,
ago. Us in
hace
Argentina,
este año,
maybe I think this year,
tuvimos que
we had to
enfrentar nuevamente
face
el
anew
debate
the debate
de qué hacer
of what to do
con la
with
renegociación
the renegotiation
del acuerdo
of the
con el Fondo
agreement
Monetario
with the
Internacional.
IMF.
Nosotros venimos
We come
de un condicionamiento de
from
larga
a
data
conditioning from
con el tema de la deuda
a lot
externa,
of data points
pero durante
regarding
el
this
gobierno de
topic.
Macri,
But
del
however, during
2015
the
al
Macri government from
del
2015
2016 al
to
2019, se
2019,
adquirió la deuda
the
externa más
debt, the
grande
external
de
debt
los últimos
that became the
50
biggest debt
años.
that we had in the last
De
50
esa deuda
years.
externa
From
se
this debt,
fugaron más de
more than
80.000
80
millones de dólares.
$1,000
Literalmente, estos
million
tipos que estuvieron en
disappeared.
el gobierno
These people in the government
pidieron
literally
guita
asked,
con la complicidad del Fondo Monetario Internacional
with the
y del
complicity
Estado
of the
Profundo
IMF
Norteamericano y de
and
Donald Trump
from Donald Trump
para
and the United
robársela.
States,
No
to
construyeron
do
un
away
solo
with this
hospital,
fund. They didn't even build
una
one
sola
single
vivienda,
hospital, one
una
single
sola
home,
fábrica.
one single
Sacaron
company.
esa guita para
They
los
took
paraísos
all of that
fiscales
to
y
their
ahora es
economic
nuestro pueblo el que
paradises,
tiene
and
que ver
now it is
qué
our
hace
people
con
who
esa
have to see what
situación.
they're going to be doing about the
Son los mismos
situation.
tipos, y hablo de
It
tipos
is
porque
these
la
same
mayoría
people, and most of
son
these
todos
are
varones,
going to be our men,
que
in
ahora
fact.
pretenden volver
They
al
pretend
gobierno
to come back
y
to
que
the government,
lamentablemente
and unfortunately,
tienen grandes chances de hacerlo.
they are likely
El
to
año que viene
be able to
nosotros
do so.
tenemos
Next year, we have
elecciones presidenciales y
presidential elections,
lamentablemente
and
tienen
unfortunately,
grandes chances de
they
volver al
have
gobierno.
a very high probability of coming back
Y
into the government.
eso no habla mal de ellos, sino
And that doesn't
fundamentalmente de
speak
nosotros.
badly about them, but fundamentally about us.
Renegociar el acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional durante este año
To
implicó
renew
una
the
fuerte
IMF
tensión
agreement meant that there was a big
dentro de
tension
nuestro frente político. Yo
in our
soy parte de
political
una
front. I
fuerza
am
que
part
hacemos
of a
parte
group
del frente político
that is
de
part of
gobierno que hoy
this
está gobernando
governmental
el
political
país.
front that is being governed
Y hubo
by
un
the
fuerte
country.
debate porque por
And there
un
was
lado
a
las
big
estadísticas
debate because
reflejan
on
una
the one
situación
hand,
social del país que es
the
preocupante.
statistics
Según
show
estadísticas oficiales, el
that
40,6% de la población en Argentina es
0.6% of the
pobre.
population in
En
Argentina is
niños, el 48%
in
de los
poverty.
niños son pobres. O sea,
48%
uno de
of
cada dos
children,
niños
one
en
out of two
Argentina son
children in
pobres.
Argentina live in poverty.
Y los niveles de indigencia
And the
son muy
levels
elevados y las
of homelessness
posibilidades
are very
de
high.
realización material
And the
de millones de
ability
compatriotas argentinos de conseguir un pedazo de
to
tierra, una
find
vivienda
property,
o ciertos derechos
housing,
laborales
or
queda cada vez más
certain
lejos
labor
e
rights
irrealizable.
are
En este
not even possible
contexto,
for
el campo
millions of
popular y
our
el sistema
Argentine
político en su
countrymen and women.
conjunto tuvimos
we
que
had
debatir
to debate
si trabajábamos para
whether we
llegar
should
a un
work
acuerdo
to
con el
reach
Fondo
an
Monetario
agreement with the
Internacional o no.
IMF or not.
De nuestro espacio
From our
político
political
planteamos que solo
space, we asked
acompañaríamos
that we would only
ese acuerdo con el
commit to that
fondo si
agreement with the
existiese
IMF if
una
there was some
clara
sort of a clear
compensación
compensation
hacia los
towards
sectores populares.
the popular sectors.
Nosotros planteábamos la necesidad de un
We
salario
also
básico
mentioned that there was a
universal
need for a
que sea
universal
cobrado por cada uno y cada una
salary
de
that should be
los
paid by
argentinos.
each and every one of
Y
the Argentine people.
hasta el día de hoy eso no
And to
ocurrió.
date,
El
that
Frente
has not
Oficialista votamos divididos
We voted at
en función de ese acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional.
in a divided
Ya
vote
que un sector importante
because
de
one important sector,
nuestros diputados y diputadas
our representatives,
entendíamos que
understood
un acuerdo con el,
that an
con el
agreement
Fondo
with the
Internacional
IMF
iba
was-
a producir,
was going
digamos,
to produce, let's say,
consecuencias nefastas para los intereses populares en
negative
nuestro país.
consequences for
Ya en el
the
acuerdo
popular
con el fondo se
interest
explicita
in our
la
country.
necesidad de reducción del déficit fiscal,
We need to
el
reduce
aumento
the
del precio de los servicios y un monitoreo de
deficit.
una comisión
Also, we
de
need
notables del Fondo
a
Monetario Internacional
commission
cada 3 meses
to monitor
del
the
rumbo de la
IMF every
política
3
económica
months
de nuestro país.
to see where the politics in our country is
Cuando hablan de
headed.
déficit
When they
fiscal
talk about
y de
the
la
fiscal
reducción del
deficit and the
déficit
reduction
fiscal
of the
de estos
deficit,
tipos,
these guys
plantean que el principal
say
problema
that
es
the
la emisión
primary
monetaria.
problem
El
is the
Estado gasta
division
mucho, tiene
of
mucho gasto
finances,
social.
that the state
Y no
has
hablan
too many
nunca de la
expenses, social
especulación
expenses, but they
financiera,
never
sobre todo producida por los
question
oligopólicos
the
de
investments
las
by
empresas
the oligarchies,
transnacionales,
by the
que
transnational
muchas
companies,
tienen terminales
that many
en
of them
estos
have
países
headquarters
como Estados
in
Unidos.
these countries,
Para
for
ponerles
example,
un
the United
ejemplo
States, for
concreto,
example. I'm going to give you an example.
más o menos el 80
More or less about
90%
80
del
to
mercado
90%
exterior
of the external
argentino
market
está
in
de
from
granos,
Argentina,
está controlado por 5 o 6
Argentina is
empresas
controlled by 5 to 6
multinacionales, algunas
multinational
seguramente ustedes
companies.
las conocen,
Some of them you might know,
Dreyfus,
Dreyfus, Cargill,
Nidera.
Nidera.
Esas empresas,
These companies,
el mismo día
the same
que
day
se desató la guerra
that the
entre
war
Ucrania
between
y
Ukraine
Rusia,
and Russia
vendieron,
exploded,
liquidaron el
they
80%
sold 80%
de los granos
of
que tenían
the
en su
wheat that they
poder
had
en la
under their control in
Argentina para
Argentina
pagar
in order to
retenciones
pay
por el precio internacional de
the
ese día,
international
asumiendo de que el
prices of that
precio
day,
se iba a
assuming
disparar
that
como
the
efectivamente
prices would
se
plummet,
disparó.
which
Esto lo
in
pueden hacer
fact,
porque
I'm
hay un
sorry,
decreto
the
que
prices
todavía no
would
se
go up.
pudo
And
sacar
this
de la
was able to do
Argentina,
because there was a
que
decree that
fue un
they weren't
decreto
able to
que se
take these
puso
out
durante
from
la dictadura
Argentina.
militar.
It was the decree
Digo,
that
no
was
se
established
pudo,
during
no
the
se
military
quiere, o
dictatorship.
no nos
I don't know
animamos a
if
sacar, no sé cuál de los
we
tres,
haven't been able to or
verbos
wanted
utilizar.
to do so,
Pero
but
les permite a estas empresas
it allows
transnacionales
these
vender,
transnational
liquidar en
companies
bolsa
sell
en ese día,
and
el día
liquidate
que se
on
desató la
that
guerra
day, the
con-
day
en
that the war
Ucrania,
between Ukraine and
y
Russia
todavía
happened.
mantienen los
And they
granos
continue to
en
have
sus
these
silos
wheats
y
in
los
their
van
silos,
liquidando,
and they continue to liquidate these,
habiendo pagado
having
retenciones
paid retention
por por el precio
for-
de ese día
for the
que pasó. De eso
for the
el Fondo Monetario
prices
Internacional
of that day.
no dice
The IMF doesn't
nada,
say a
¿no?
thing about that.
Algunas reflexiones sobre este proceso
Some thoughts
en el
about this
cual,
process in
digamos,
which
nuestro frente político quedó
our
muy
political
debilitado
front
a partir de
was weakened as a consequence
debate,
of
¿no?
this debate.
En primer lugar,
First of all,
ni el gobierno ni nosotros
neither the
como
government
espacio
nor
político,
us as a
siendo
political
parte del
front,
gobierno,
being
tuvimos la
part of the
capacidad
government, were
de
able
construir un
to have the
proceso
capacity to
pedagógico
construct
con nuestro
an
pueblo
educational
de
process
las
with our
implicancias
communities about
concretas
the implicities, the
de tener
implications
al Fondo
of
Monetario
having the
Internacional
IMF
monitoreando nuestras
monitoring
economías para
our
elevar
economies in order
la
to
conciencia
increase
de nuestro
the
pueblo para
conscience of our
consolidar
people to
horizontes de
consolidate
soberanía e independencia.
sovereignty and
En
independence.
segundo lugar, tuvimos
Secondly,
poca capacidad,
we
creo que
had
tenemos poca capacidad
little
todavía
capacity, and I think we
para
have a little
articular
capacity
este
in
tipo
order
de
to articulate
agendas
these types of agendas
en trabajos concretos
with
en el
concrete
plano
examples in
internacional,
terms of an international
desde los
front,
sectores populares.
from the popular front.
Y en tercer lugar,
And
tenemos un
third, we
problema.
have a problem.
Hablaba una compañera, una compatriota mía hoy a la
There's
mañana
a
de falta de
colleague in the
autoestima,
morning
¿no?
that spoke about
Tenemos
lack
un
of
problema
self-esteem.
de
We
falta
have
de
a problem
autoestima, de
of
debilidad
self-esteem,
estratégica
about
para
strategic
poder
weakness
radicalizar
in order to
nuestras agendas,
focus our
nuestras
agendas
propuestas
and radicalize them, our processes and
Seguimos
our
pensando,
proposals. We continue to
me
think
refiero al sistema político de
about
espaldas al pueblo.
the
En
political
realidad,
system that is
lo que
turning its
pasa
back
muchas veces es
to
que hay
people.
poco
And what
pueblo
happens is that
en las
there's
estructuras políticas,
very little representation from the people in these
pretendiendo
political
ser
structures,
buenos alumnos en los
pretending to be
marcos
good
de este sistema
students
que
in the
cada vez
framework
muestra
of these
más sus
systems, which
limitaciones.
continually
No
shows
pensamos
more
en
and more
posibilidades
the
que pateen,
limitation. We
aunque
do
sea
not
un
think about
poco
what
el tablero.
possibilities there are.
Un dato en todo el debate de
In this whole
del
debate
Fondo Monetario Internacional en nuestro
about the
país.
IMF in our
¿Saben quiénes
country,
votaron
do
también
you
en
know who
contra
voted
del
against
acuerdo con el Fondo
the
Monetario
agreement with the
Internacional?
IMF?
La extrema derecha.
The far
Obviamente,
right.
por
Obviously,
razones diferentes,
for different
pero
reasons,
asumiendo la
but
necesidad de
assuming
cuestionar
the need to
abiertamente
question openly
la estatalidad. Este espacio viene
the
asumiendo
response of the government, and this
el discurso más radical hoy del sistema político
is
argentino.
having the most
Es un discurso
radical
antiestado y que interpela
discourse
cada vez más a los
in the
sectores de la
state,
juventud.
and it continues to increase
Un sujeto
its
muy
popularity
dinámico,
in
y ya para
the
pasar a
youth.
la
And
parte
then
propositiva y linda de
let me
todo este
just go now
relato,
to the other side of
que
this
viene
story
cobrando
that's a little
mucho
bit
protagonismo, digamos, en la dinámica
nicer,
de la lucha social en Argentina, es lo que nosotros llamamos la
what we
economía
call
popular,
the popular economy,
organizada
organized
bajo las formas de cooperativas y
under
espacios
cooperatives,
comunitarios.
community spaces.
El proceso de conformación de este
The
sujeto político se
processes
asienta en una característica
is
estructural del
founded
sistema
in a
capitalista en su
structural
modo de
capacity.
acumulación actual. Hay un
There
porcentaje
is a
cada vez mayor
percentage,
de la
an
clase
increasing percentage
trabajadora que no va a
of
ser
the working people
incorporada
that is not
en el
going
mercado
to
formal de
incorporate
trabajo.
itself
Por
into
más
the
reactivación
formal
económica que
labor
haya,
movement.
crecimiento
It doesn't matter
económico que
how
haya,
much
es una condición,
increase in
nosotros
economic
creemos,
activity there
estructural
is a condition. We want to restructure
el desarrollo de las
the
fuerzas
development
productivas hoy
of
en
the
este sistema capitalista.
reproductive
La reactivación y
forces,
crecimiento económico que se produjo
the
en el ciclo
reactivation
anterior
of
del
the
gobierno
increase in
que
economic
tuvimos de
activity
derecha reincorporó a un
started
sector
to
importante de la
reincorporate
población al
an
mercado de
important sector
trabajo,
of the
pero
population to
desde
the
una
economic
condición de la
market.
informalidad.
But
Nosotros
however,
hablamos de
from an
precarización
informal condition,
laboral.
we're
El
talking
Estado
about
incluso tuvo que
the
asumir
state
la creación de ciertas políticas
had
públicas para
to
crear
create certain
cooperativas
political
y trabajo en obra
policies
pública,
to
ya que el sector
create
privado no llegaba a
cooperatives and
incorporar a
other
esta mano de
activities
obra, a
because the
pesar
private
de
sector
que
was not
tuvimos
able to
6-7 años
incorporate
de
these other
crecimiento
groups,
económico del
even though we had
país
6 to
que
7
arrojó
years
entre el
of
8
economic
y
growth in the
el
country
10%, ¿no?
that increased to an 8 and 10%.
2007-2009, emergencia de la crisis internacional.
The international crisis.
Eso produjo, digamos, un escenario
This produced
que fue punto de inflexión en
a
las
scene that
economías
was a
centrales
point
de
of
Estados
inflection
Unidos,
in the central
en
economies in
España,
the US,
y que
in
empezó
Spain,
a quebrar
and it
un poco la
began to
hegemonía
break apart a little bit the
norteamericana
hegemon, the
y
North American
produciendo algo
hegemony,
que para
and to
nosotros
produce
todavía
something
es
that
muy
for
difícil de
us is
predecir
still
qué va a
very
pasar,
difficult
pero es el
to
corrimiento
say
del
what's
poder
going to happen,
económico
but it's
hacia Oriente por primera vez
the
en
current
la
of
historia
that
del
economic
capitalismo.
power.
En
It
el
broke
marco
that for the
nacional
first
tuvimos
time.
un fuerte
And in the
enfrentamiento en esa
international mark,
época
we have a
con
front
las
on that
oligarquías
time with
del poder
the
económico
oligarchies,
concentrado. El
the
gobierno en ese
concentrated
momento
economic power.
pierde
The
esa
government at that
batalla y
time
eso
lost that
genera, digamos,
fight,
un punto de
and that
inflexión que
created
va a
an
marcar el
inflection
proceso
point, which is
político
going
inclusive
to
hasta la
mark
actualidad.
the political
Porque en
process
esta
even to
alza
today.
de los precios
Because
internacionales que está
in
habiendo
that,
producto del conflicto en Ucrania,
what is
hoy
producing the
es
conflict in
palabra tabú
Ukraine, which
hablar de
is
la
it's now a
posibilidad de
taboo to talk
regular
about the possibility of
la renta
regulating
extraordinaria que están
the
teniendo, digamos,
extraordinary
sobre todo las
rent that
principales
we have with all of the
multinacionales. En el
principal, the
2013
main multinational companies.
nace,
In
sale a la calle por primera
2013,
vez en el marco del 1 de mayo
on the 1st
herramienta
of
de
May,
carácter gremial
we see
de este sector
a
de la
professional
economía
sector
popular que
from the
aglutina un
popular
conjunto de
economy,
organizaciones, movimientos
which
populares que
creates a
trabajan
group of
fuertemente
organizations that
en este
work
sector.
very strong
Hoy
in that
el
sector.
sindicato que
And today, the
nuclea a
union,
este sector de la economía
which
popular
is the
nuclea alrededor de
nuclear
500.000
of that sector,
trabajadores y
it's about
trabajadoras de la
500
economía popular,
workers.
vendedores ambulantes,
They are
recicladores
street
urbanos,
vendors,
pequeños productores y
recyclers,
campesinos,
small
liberados
producers,
del sistema
and
presidiario,
farmers.
jóvenes recuperados del consumo,
They
trabajadores y
are
trabajadoras
workers
textiles.
and textile workers.
construcción y visibilización de este
From the
sujeto hemos
construction
podido
and the
avanzar en ciertas
visibilization of
leyes
that
que fueron
product,
importantes
we
para la
saw a couple of laws that were
del
important
sector de la economía popular.
from the
Una de esas
popular
leyes
economy
fue la ley
sector,
de
and one of
emergencia
those laws
social
was
que
the
hoy
law of social emergency,
otorga
which
a una
today
porción
gives
de la clase
a
trabajadora
portion
bajo esta
gives to a
situación
portion
un
of
salario
the
social
working
complementario
class
para
a
complementar el sueldo que
complementary
se gana todos los
social
días de
subsidy
manera informal y se
to,
creó el Registro
and it
Nacional de Trabajadores de la
created a
Economía Popular
national
que nos sirvió
registry
para
for the
construir ciertas
economy, the
estadísticas del
popular
sector.
economy.
Hoy en el registro hay anotados
Today in
alrededor de
the
3 millones
register,
de
there
trabajadores.
are 3
Calculamos que
million
hay un
workers, and we
30% de la clase
calculate that there is
trabajadora argentina
30%
que
of
está
the working
en el
class
marco del
which
mercado
is
informal
in the
de
informal
trabajo. El
market,
57%
and
de esas
the
trabajadoras inscritas
55%
son
of
mujeres,
those
digamos, hay
workers are
una
women.
feminización,
So there is a
digamos,
feminization, we could say,
el
of
mercado informal
the
de
informal
trabajo
market
y el
in the workplace,
64% son
and the
jóvenes. También los jóvenes
64% are
son,
young
digamos, de
people.
los más
They're
afectados por
young,
esta
and they are the ones who are
lógica
most affected by that
sistema.
logic
En
of
este
the
marco,
system.
algunos de los
And in
desafíos
that
que
framework, there's
entendemos
a couple challenges
que están planteados, ¿no?
that
Yo
we are posing.
particularmente trabajo en lo que es el sector
Specifically, I
de
work
pequeños productores,
with
campesinos,
small
el
producers
sector
and
rural.
farmers in the rural
Nosotros
sector,
producimos
and we
una gran
produce
cantidad de alimentos. Por
a
ejemplo,
great
por poner
amount
algunas cifras,
of,
el
to give
60%
you an
de la
idea,
cebolla que se
the
produce en el país se
66%
produce
of onions that are produced in our
nuestro
country
movimiento. El
is from
80%
our
de la
movement.
frutilla que
The
se exporta a
80%
Estados
of
Unidos se
berries that are
produce en
imported to the US
el
are
movimiento.
produced in our
Tenemos un gran
movement,
problema
and
cuando
we
tenemos que
have a
avanzar
great
a
problem
enfrentar
when we
a
want
esas
to advance
estructuras
in
de mercado
these structures of the
que
market
están oligopolizadas y
that
que están
they are
transnacionalizadas, ¿no?
monopolized
No hemos
and they
podido
are
dar
transnational. We have not been able to
fuertemente, digamos, con estrategias
give
que
a
avancen,
strong
digamos, en,
strategy
por ejemplo,
to
construir
advance
una
in
comercialización
constructing
desde los sectores
commercialization from the popular
Algunos
base.
desafíos que entendemos que están
One of the
planteados en este
challenges
escenario,
that is
que
being
también
presented
no los
to
creemos
us
que son
is
solamente para
that,
Argentina,
and it's not just for
sino
Argentina,
para el conjunto de nuestra
but
región
it's in the whole group
o el
of our
continente.
region or the continent.
Primero,
The first
creemos
one,
que tenemos que avanzar
we think that we
fuertemente
need to
en
advance very strongly
reconducir o
in
reimpulsar, mejor dicho, la movilización popular, no
reorganizing the
solamente para
popular
defender lo
mobilization,
conquistado, no
not
solamente el
just to
carácter de
defend what
resistencia,
we have already
sino que tenemos
gained
que
and to
generar
have
un
a
proceso de
resistant
movilización
character, but to
popular
also
para
generate that
lograr nuevas
the character to
En segundo lugar,
have more gains.
creemos que
And in
tenemos
the
que avanzar en
second
construir
place, we need to
desde una
advance
democracia
our
protagónica
construction
y
of
popular. Ahí el
of a
ejemplo, y
protagonist
por algo
democracy.
han
There's an
sido
example.
excluidos de esta cumbre, el ejemplo de
There is an
Cuba,
example,
de
the example of
Venezuela,
Cuba
de
and
Nicaragua,
Venezuela and
son
Nicaragua, who were
importantes para
excluded from this
sacar
summit.
luces
They are
en
important
este
to
sentido.
bring
Creemos
light
que
to
tenemos que
that.
construir de una
And
democracia
we need to
protagónica
construct
y
a
popular proyectos
protagonist
nacionales de un
democracy,
país
and
fundamentalmente radicalizando desde
from a
los
country
sectores
which is
populares las
radicalizing
agendas que
the
hoy
popular
están
sectors.
planteadas, porque si no se las dejamos servidas,
If
digamos,
not,
a la derecha.
then we're
En
just
tercer
going to,
lugar,
everything is going to
dar
move
la
to the
batalla
right.
cultural y
And then the
comunicacional,
cultural battle,
construyendo un relato de esperanza,
creating
de
a
futuro,
narrative of
de
hope,
nueva
of the
épica,
future, of
que
a new
enamore a
time,
nuestros pueblos
which
valorizando el sentido de lo
enchants
comunitario,
our
de la
public,
solidaridad,
our
del
people,
amor
in
por el
terms
que
of
la
the
o el que
solidarity and the
tenemos al lado.
love that we have at our side.
Por las injusticias,
And because of the
luchando contra
injustices,
la
we are
naturalización a
fighting
la que nos quieren
against
acostumbrar.
that it
Retomar
would
con
become something
alegría
that's
la
natural to
felicidad de
them,
sentirnos libres
and
de
the
estar
happiness
luchando
to
en
feel
conjunto.
free and to be
Debemos
fighting
retomar
together. We
una
need to
agenda de
retake
integración
an
radical y
agenda
popular que
of
ponga
a
en el
popular
centro
radical
de
agenda
esa
that puts
planificación de
at
la
the center
estrategia a
of
las
it
juventudes
the
y a
strategies
nuestras
of young
compañeras
people
en
and
defensa de la
our
naturaleza
young
de un
women,
horizonte de
and to
emancipación, de
defend
justicia social
a
y de
horizon
soberanía.
of
Son tiempos
sovereignty and
difíciles,
justice.
pero
They are
mientras
difficult
existan
times, but
atropellos a
since they are
injusticias,
here
seguirán
and there
existiendo
are
luchas y
injustices,
resistencias.
and then
Y es
therefore
ahí
there will
donde
continue
nuestros
to be
sueños de otro
resistance and
mundo se
fights,
fortalecen.
and from there
Qué
our
mejor
world
ejemplo
will
que la
become
lucha que todos
stronger.
los días
And what better
cientos de
example
miles y
than
hombres y
every day
mujeres
hundreds
están
and
librando
hundreds
aquí mismo, en las
people
entrañas
are here
del propio
liberating
monstruo.
themselves
El
from
futuro es
their
nuestro
own
porque el
monster.
amor por
And the
nuestra
future,
tierra
the love
y
for
la
our
vida
planet and our
prevalecerá
life
al
will
odio
prevail
del dinero y la codicia.
over
Muchas gracias.
hate and greed. Thank you.
How do we build the confidence and the self-esteem of our people's
¿Cómo
movements
generamos
in a period
el
of
autoestima
systemic
de
crisis,
nuestras
in a phase
personas
where imperialism is
en una
entering
crisis
a more
sistémica,
dangerous and
en
more
una
violent
época en donde la crisis se pone
process?
más?
Our fourth speaker is Mercedes Lopez Peña, the Executive Director of Centro de Integracion para Migrantes, Trabajadoras y Trabajadores, CIMITRA, in El Salvador.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Realmente, como lo decían nuestros compañeros de panel, primero lo siento igual que Manuel, voy a hablar en español.
It's the best way to speak my ideas clearly.
Definitivamente, Argentina, El Salvador,
Definitely, Argentina and El Salvador and many of the countries that are represented here in the summit,
vamos a tratar de socializar
we are going to
la
try to
experiencia y
socialize
hablar
our
sobre el tema de la
experience and to
deuda, las
talk
sanciones y
about
el robo de
debt,
recursos,
sanctions, and the
más desde
theft
la
of
vivencia,
resources,
que
more
es la
than
parte,
the
digamos,
our
más
lived
complicada.
experience, which is the
Porque
most
son
complicated
impactos
part,
que se tienen
because
en
their
los pueblos directamente
impacts
de
on
estos temas que ahora
the
estamos
communities
abordando en
directly,
esta
and
cumbre
that
de los
is
pueblos por la
the
democracia.
theme that we are looking at today in this democratic summit.
Cuando nos plantearon la idea de
When
participar y
they
recibimos la
asked us the
invitación,
idea and we
realmente
received the
empezaron como las
invitation
reflexiones
and we
del
started to
significado de la
reflect on the meaning of the summit,
Y precisamente es un
and
espacio donde podamos compartir
precisely it's a
ciertas
space in which we
reflexiones,
can
como lo decía
share
Manuel
certain
ahorita y los otros
reflections, as
compañeros del
Manuel was
panel,
saying, and our
y
other
lo que hemos escuchado en
panelists,
los
and
dos
that we
días
have heard
anteriores.
in other days as well.
E ir delineando qué tipo de
And to
acciones,
delineate
qué
what
tipo de
type of
estrategias
actions,
podemos
what type
definir en
of
estos espacios.
strategies we can
Ya
define in these
decíamos, no pueden ser
spaces.
solamente espacios
And then
de
they're not
socialización, de
just
deliberación,
spaces
de
of
análisis,
socialization or
sino también espacios que logren
liberation or
concretar
analysis.
acciones.
They are spaces in which we can
Y en
make
ese
our actions
sentido,
concrete.
yo quisiera
And in that sense, I would
iniciar esta
like to
intervención
begin this
con,
speech
con una idea central.
with a
O varias
central
ideas
idea,
centrales, pero
or
entre
perhaps
ellas, la
various
primera.
central ideas, but the main one
Definitivamente debemos de dimensionar
we definitely need to
que
mention
lo que ahora tenemos como mundo
that what we
es
have
producto de la
right now as
resistencia
a
y
world
lucha
is a
de todos
product
nuestros
of the
antepasados.
resistance and fight of
Si
all
no
of our
dimensionamos
ancestors.
eso,
If we
estamos
don't
un
mention that,
poquito
we
complicados
are
en
a
el análisis.
little complicated
Porque lo
in
que
our
demuestra
analysis,
es
because
que las
what it shows
intervenciones
is
en nuestros
that the
países
interventions in our
no es que
countries,
no hayan encontrado
it's not that
esa
they
lucha y esa
haven't
resistencia y
found
donde nos
our fight
negamos a
and our
permanecer
resistance in which we
como pueblo y como
denied
cultura y
them
todo lo
as
que eso
a people,
conlleva.
as a culture,
Yo creo que ese es un tema
I
sumamente
think that
importante.
is a very
O sea,
important
ahora
topic.
hablamos con esta
Right now,
libertad,
we are talking
pero
about
se lo
this
debemos
liberty,
a
but
otra
we
generación.
owe it to another generation.
Si no si estas
And
generaciones
if
desde
that,
nuestros ancestros y
if
la
that
lucha que
generation of our
actualmente llevamos,
ancestors and the
si no
fight that
hubiera
we
existido, no
have now,
existiera,
if that fight hadn't occurred,
imaginémonos el mundo que tendríamos.
imagine the world that we would be seeing now.
No tenemos un mundo, seguimos luchando por un mundo mejor.
We continue
Pero
to
el
fight for
mundo
a
sería
better world,
peor si
but
esos
the
pueblos no se
world would
hubieran
have been
resistido y
worse
no
if
hubieran
those people
luchado
had not
para lograr lo
resisted,
que
had
ahora
not
tenemos.
fought for what we have
Yo creo que ese es
now.
un tema que
So
debemos
I
de
think that
dimensionar
is a topic we
profundamente.
really should
Y lo
mention
digo porque El
profoundly.
Salvador es
And I
ejemplo de
say
esas
it because
luchas y
El
miles de
Salvador is an
asesinados y
example
desaparecidos
of those fights, of
para que
thousands
podamos
of murders and
medianamente
thousands
hablar
of
en
deaths
libertad.
to get to our
La
liberty
segunda
of
idea que yo
freedom.
quisiera plantear, y lo
And the
decía
second
en otros
idea that I would
espacios,
like to pose,
que va ligada a
that we
esta
can say in
primera,
these spaces,
es
which is similar to the
necesitamos
first, or
revisar,
related to the first. We
reconocer
need
y
to
dar a conocer
recognize
nuestra
and
historia.
make it recognized our history.
si no revisamos
If we do not
de dónde venimos
review or look at where we
y
come
si
from,
no
and if
aprendemos
we do not
de lo que hemos
learn
vivido como
from what we
pueblo,
have
cada
lived
uno con
as a
sus
people,
características,
and each people with
cada
their
uno con su
characteristic,
bandera de
each
lucha,
people
pero al
with
final en
their
las calles resistiendo y
flag
luchando,
fighting in the
si
streets
no
and
aprendemos de
resisting,
esa
if we do
historia,
not learn from that story
de
and from that
verdad
history,
vamos a volver a cometer los
really
mismos
we are going
errores.
to commit the same mistakes
Tercer
again.
tema con revisar y
And the
aprender de
third
nuestra
topic
historia.
of reviewing and
Las
looking at our
nuevas
history,
generaciones,
the
los
new
jóvenes,
generations, the young people,
mujeres y hombres, que son
women
las que
and
están
men
retomando
who are
nuestras
taking
banderas,
that
las
up,
banderas de las
taking up
anteriores
our
generaciones,
flag and the flag
necesitan conocer.
of the previous generations.
Porque
They need
generalmente
to
los
know that
pueblos
history
tenemos
as
memoria
well,
corta.
because we have a very short memory.
Generalmente acabamos de tener una
Generally,
gran batalla,
we
la
finish a
ganamos, la
huge
convertimos
fight,
en
we
un
win
derecho,
it, and we make it a
pero
right,
al día siguiente se
and
nos
then the
olvidó
next day we
lo
forget.
que implicó en
We
lucha
forget
esa
what the
conquista.
fight, what that win
Son temas que yo creo
implied
que
in that
nosotros
fight,
debemos
but
de
they are
abordar
topics that
con
we
nuestra juventud.
need to take up with
Por eso
our
yo
young
decía,
people.
necesitamos primero
That's what I'm saying,
dimensionar
so we
a
need to
quienes le
first
debemos
mention
esto.
who do we owe this to.
Revisar todo ese
We need
camino
to look at that
andado
whole path that was already
y
taken
aprender las lecciones
and to learn the
y
lessons
reforzar lo bueno que hemos
and to
hecho.
reinforce the good that we have
Porque sí ha
done,
existido unidad en la lucha,
because there has been unity in
pero
the fight.
obviamente hay
But
fuerzas que se
obviously there are
encargan de
also
dividirnos como pueblos.
forces
No
that
solamente las
take
fronteras físicamente
charge
hablando,
to divide us as people,
sino hasta entre
and not just
nosotros mismos.
physically, but also among ourselves.
Pueblo que desconoce u olvida su historia
People
está
that
expuesto a
does
repetir.
not know their history
Y yo no
is
creo que estemos como pueblos a
destined to
esta
repeat
altura de
it.
la vida dispuestos a
And
regresar a la
we
esclavitud,
we could be
a la
going back
experiencia
to
del
slavery,
holocausto,
we could be back to
al
enclosures,
aniquilamiento de todas nuestras
to the
comunidades indígenas, como en
annihilation
el caso
of
del
our
Salvador lo
indigenous
lograron.
communities like
Son
they
muy
did
pequeñas
in
las
El
comunidades
Salvador.
indígenas que aún
There are
sobreviven
very
en mi
few
país.
indigenous communities that are still alive in
No
my
creo que
country.
querramos regresar a esa.
I don't think that we want to
Entonces sí
return to that.
necesitamos
So we do
dimensionar
need
lo que nos han
to
heredado
mention
otras
what we have
generaciones.
inherited from other generations.
Es increíble cómo en las
It
universidades,
is incredible
en las
how in
escuelas,
universities, in
en los
schools,
colegios,
and in
en la academia, que ahora le
colleges,
llamamos,
and in the academy, as we call it now,
todavía dicen que nos
they
descubrieron, que
still
descubrieron
say
América.
that they discovered
Y nos dan toda
that
una
they
letanía
discovered
sobre el
America.
descubrimiento de América. Y así lo siguen.
And
Así
they
se
still,
sigue trasladando la historia.
they still say that as part
Nunca
of the
nos han dicho
history.
que fue un colonialismo.
They never say that it was
Nunca nos han
colonialism.
explicado
They've never
los miles
explained to us
de
the
comunidades
thousands
que fueron
of communities
aniquiladas
that were annihilated
cuando se dio precisamente el mal
when
llamado
this
descubrimiento de América.
wrongly called
Lo
discovery
grave
of
es que
America
se sigue
happened. And
trasladando
the
la
worst thing is
historia
that
de
that
esa
history is
forma,
continued to be given in that
lo
form,
cual es sumamente grave.
which is extremely serious.
Porque entonces vamos a seguir
Because then we
vendados,
are
las
going
nuevas
to
generaciones
continue
van a seguir creyendo que
blindfolded,
definitivamente todo fue
believing that
un paraíso
everything was a
cuando se
paradise
descubrió América, entre
when
comillas.
when America was discovered, in quotes.
Yo hacía una lista cuando estaba
I
pensando
was
en lo que
making a list when I
quería
was thinking
socializar
about what
acá.
I wanted to talk
Yo
about
decía
today
aspectos como
here, and I was
aniquilamiento. Imagínense
listing
las
things
palabras que
like,
voy a decir ahorita.
imagine these words that I'm going to say
Pero esa
right
es la
now,
vivencia.
but that's the
Es la
experience.
vivencia de los
That
diferentes
is our lived
pueblos.
experience in different people.
Sometimiento,
Annihilation,
militarismo,
subjugation,
intervenciones,
militarism, intervention, dictators, repression,
alzamientos, luchas sociales,
social fights, armed
imposición de intereses,
conflict, imposition of,
privatización,
of
deuda entre las
interests,
naciones. En resumen,
debt, and
un
to
total
summarize,
irrespeto a la humanidad.
a complete disrespect of humanity.
Si venimos de eso que ahora
If we
hemos
come
y
from
podemos
that,
seguir
and I could
podemos
continue,
continuar
we could continue
definiendo
defining concepts of what we have lived, of what different people have lived. Of course, each one based on their own characteristics and in their own territory. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the lived experience from El Salvador. In El Salvador, I'd like to tell you that not even 1% of the population of 6 million people or more, not even 1% of the population, we don't even have.
Solo en 1932, cuando hubo uno de los primeros alzamientos
In 1932, when we had the first uprising against the dictatorship, there were more than 30 people that were killed. That's in the history of El Salvador. In one massacre, more than 30,000 people were murdered. When there was an opposition, when there were farmers with machetes, that's part of our history. When at the end we were able to gain the supposed independence from the incorrectly called the discovery of America in that tiny part of El Salvador, because one of my colleagues says we're so tiny, so tiny. We started a different stage in our history. It wasn't that type of colonialism. We started then with what we call in El Salvador the 14 oligarch families. That's also part of our story. If you look for that, you'll be able to find that. A small group of families that took control over a good part of the property and the territory of our country. And that's when we start a subjugation of a different kind. But at the end, it's still a subjugation, but also with a lot of resistance. Because in the history, if we look, we can find, for example, strikes, uprisings, but then we also meet a repression. For each uprising, for each time that would go against the interest of a new form of subjugation against the Salvadoran people, we would see the disappearances, the murders. El Salvador lived an armed conflict that was more than 12 years, a war between the military, the government and its military at that time, and also against and between a guerrilla movement that was now, that is now, the Faramundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional. There were more than 70,000 disappears, what we know of. But there are statistics that are even worse than this. And there was a number of massacres that we had in my country, precisely to try to annihilate that opposition movement. There were murders. Foreigners, there were foreigners, nuns that were murdered, journalists that were foreigners. Well, there were 6 people that were murdered in the UCA, the Central American University. That's something that is well known. It was murder, who now is our Saint Romero, our bishop back then in 1980. He was also murdered in cold blood while he was preaching. He got a shot exactly right here. That's how catechists, nuns, priests from Salvador were murdered. And I'm going to give the statistics. More than 60,000 killed, 70,000 disappeared, who till now, like in Argentina, many family members continue to search for their loved ones. They've never been found. And all of this with the accompaniment of who? With the financing of who? It was more than $2 million that were being invested every day in that war. The military and the government back then would not have had the capacity to carry out and to face a guerrilla that was present, and the strength of the guerrilla movement was that it was immersed among the people. That was their strength. That was their strength. And that's what made it a victorious group. Likewise, that conflict ended with the peace agreements. El Salvador is one of the first countries where that had, let's say, the experience of having both sides of the war sit down. Of course, Mexico, France, and other countries recognized and went to be part of the mediating team back then. And at the end, they were able to get the peace agreements in 1992. That's when we start a new historical movement and a new historical phase. And that's the reason what I was saying, that we're going to move from violence to, when we were starting to talk about sanctions, etc., we're going to be talking from our lived experiences, and that's basically what's happened in the history of all of our countries. In that sense, I would like to add to those historical moments that we've already mentioned other subjects that have continued to emerge. It's not that we've gone beyond what we've already mentioned, but we've had all of these problems added that are maybe, let's say, more modern, that don't belong to those decades. Now we're talking about weakened democracies. That's what we call weakened democracies. Lack of transparency in regards to public funds, violations of human rights, inequality, injustice, xenophobia, repression, violence, criminality, and extortions. To what we've talked about, we're now going to add all of these new challenges, problems, situations that we are facing at this moment, right now. I say that we are living the result of a long battle. And that's the reason why I was saying, let's give a dimension to who have brought us to this moment. And that's the result of that fight. And that's why I want to underline this. And I try to mention this every time that I'm able to. This fight has been a permanent fight, and the resistance has been a permanent fight in the people. I used to say identifying the causes of migration. It's just identifying the causes is not difficult. El Salvador has 6.5 million citizens. Of those, at least 2 million of those, because probably the numbers are higher, but at least 2 million of them live outside of the Salvadoran territory, and the majority of them live here. But migration is being battled in this country. They're being treated as the worst delinquents when they go through a deportation process. But those migrants are the result of the policies that were carried out in our countries. That's what they are. I was a migrant when I was a young woman in this country. Now I live in my country. Migration is a result of those policies that were implemented in our countries. But here, we battle against the migrants. Here, TPS is really hard to get. Yesterday, we went to the workshop with the colleagues from the Alliance. So definitely, we are living through the results of those policies. Of course, now we have different types of migrations. El Salvador. So I work with deported populations, countrymen and women that go back to El Salvador. And I was saying, you know, they come with so many injuries, open wounds. I really love the book, The Open Veins of Latin America. That's what migrants are coming with. And one of my colleagues was saying in a meeting of migrant women in El Salvador, she was saying, it is painful to any person leave their land, but it is particularly painful for a woman. because she gets up at 3, 4 in the morning the day that she's going to leave her country, and she says to her children that she's going to be back in a few moments without knowing really when she's going to come back. And that's why we have generations, us Salvadorans, in our migrant population, we have generations of young people that have seen their mothers and fathers only till they were 20. With the technology, they basically met through the phone. But they've reunified only after 20, 25 years. In that sense, what we would like to bring here to you with all of the delegations here present, all the participants here, I understand that is more than 200 organizations that have sent representatives to this summit. And I think it really speaks about the effort that has been made, but we really need to find a way to unify to come together in one single fight, because it's not about his fight is not my fight. It's not about their fight is not my fight. It's one single fight, and that's what we need to understand. If we do not unite, like they say, the example is very beautiful. If I, with this finger, try to, as much as I try to do it with each single one of my fingers is difficult, but if I do it with my fist, we're going to be strong. And that's how we need to be, humanity. The fight for the environment. 92% of our rivers in El Salvador are completely contaminated. Our population consumes completely contaminated water. Therefore, we have many challenges, but we're not going to be able to be victorious if we continue on our own separate fights. So what I think is that our efforts in the space that we are having is extremely important so that we can advance in these challenges that we've been sharing in these 3 days. Thank you so much.
We owe a great debt not to the banks, but to our ancestors who created these traditions of struggle, and a debt to the future generations who will inherit these traditions of struggle. We have a very special video message for us, which we'll conclude the panel with. As we know, the United States government has never used testing, tracing, and isolation to address the coronavirus, right? They talk a lot about many bad things they say about the COVID zero policy of China. Apparently it's a COVID 1 million plus policy in the United States. But the United States government has used testing, tracing, and isolation to attack socialism, right? Not the disease, but it isolates and quarantines socialism. The blockade of Cuba is not only economic, you know, what we have gathered in this panel to discuss and think about. The blockade is also intellectual. It's also cultural. It's a blockade of personal and individual relationships. It's a quarantine from scientific experiments in the future, in a humanist future. It's a complete degradation of humanity, as you said. So we have a very special message from Daniel Abner Rodriguez, a young entrepreneur and a member of the Cuban Association of Artisan Artists, ACAA. The video will play in Spanish audio, and the English will be on the interpretation device.
Buenas tardes, hermanos y hermanas de nuestros pueblos de América y de América. Primero que todo, mi agradecimiento a los organizadores de esta cumbre. Gracias por darme la oportunidad de
Here with you today and to raise my voice as a free Cuban in defense and on behalf of Cuban civil society. My name is Daniel Ramirez Rodriguez. I am a young entrepreneur. A little bit over a year ago, I created my own business here in Cuba. Today, I am the owner of the paint brand Potranco, Prodanco, a brand with which I produce various types of paint, including acrylic, vinyl, emulsions, animals, oils, and many more. When I was told about this summit, I made every effort to participate, and I am here today. And more than a thank you, for me, it is a source of pride and a great opportunity to settle a moral debt with myself, with my family, with my country. Since as a Cuban entrepreneur, having my business here in Cuba, I do not escape, but I am also a victim of um, of of that famous embargo which has plagued my country for many years. The blockade has existed for as long as I can remember, and many times, many of us have taken it as something normal, something that is completely normal, because it is not normal for a country or a people, or let's say anyone, to impose its will on another, be it for size, be it for development, be it for whatever reason, especially when it is a country like ours, which has proven to be a country with certain standards of humanity, and a country that is completely sovereign and free. So as an entrepreneur, rather than escaping, I am in the eye of the hurricane. And now I'm speaking to you, President Biden. As I was saying, I am a Cuban, as we say here in Cuba, a full-blooded Cuban, that your administration and your government claims to protect, or for whom you want to fight or protect. Because you say that the blockade, the embargo against Cuba is not against the people of Cuba, but against the state. And here is where I want to tell you something. The state and the people of Cuba are one and the same thing. You know, as I was telling you, as a young, carefree, immature person, until I had to experience it firsthand in the flesh, I didn't know the damage that the blockade was really doing, which you, even in the midst of this pandemic that hit our country and all the countries of the world in a brutal way, you intensified it, increased it, without caring about what could happen to the people you claim to protect. And I want the world to know it. I want the world to know that the Cuban entrepreneurs here are fighting a battle every day to be able to develop. Mr. President of the United States, Biden, I want you to know that as Cuban, I do not feel at all represented by that policy, which you say is for the people of Cuba, or for the freedom of the people of Cuba. Here in Cuba, we are free, and the only thing we need is that you and your government should realize that in our country there is a development project in which we, who are fundamental actors, are doing a little bit to grow and develop, and you are constantly holding us back. And President Biden, I tell you this. If socialism, as you say, is something decadent and something that doesn't work, give us the opportunity that we are a free country. Give us the opportunity to crush ourselves, but don't clip our wings. Not only we Cubans are missing from the opportunity to do business with you, but also the American people, the people so beautiful and with so much history, and with so much history of love that there is between our people and another. It is sad and it's shameful that we cannot relate in the way, in a freely way that as humans, it is our right to be able to do. I, President, as a Cuban, I urge you to give us the opportunity to demonstrate that that it is worthwhile, because perhaps you think it is not, but Our socialism and our revolution will continue to make conquests and will continue to achieve things even if you do not want it to. Give us the opportunity, and I am sure that we are going to show you that our way of living, our way of thinking, the way we have chosen, with which we have chosen to live, perhaps it is a much better path than the path you chose one day. A big hug to all the representatives of all of those who have been part of this summit. For me, it has been an honor and a source of pride to be there. Thank you very much.
I just have two things to close. First of all,
Entonces, nada más tengo dos
the
cosas
final
ya para
plenary
cerrar.
for today will
Primero
be
que nada,
meeting
la
downstairs
plenaria
in the
final
large
va
hall,
a
so
ser en
please
el
head down
cuarto
there after
en la
this panel
parte
is
de
over.
abajo.
And
Entonces,
second,
por favor, vayan
just a
para allá.
reminder that
Una vez
the
que
march will
termine
be
este
taking
panel y
place
después
tomorrow.
también,
We'll convene here
la
and move
marcha,
from
la
here
acción
at
va
5
a
p.m.
tomar
tomorrow,
lugar
Friday.
mañana y va a concluir a las 5 p.m.
Let's close with
Entonces,
another round of
vamos a
applause and
cerrar
thanks
con
for
otra
our
ronda
panelists.
de aplausos y muchísimas gracias a nuestros panelistas.